So I've spoken already about working in Sheffield. After Sheffield, we went to Leeds, and I worked for a church in Leeds for a while. And part of my job, toward the end of my time in Leeds, was to work with a kind of a church plant. We were part of a bigger church, but we were a small congregation which had gone out to work on a housing estate in a place called Bramley in Leeds. And we used to meet in a school, and that became the school that I then went on to work for. But whilst we were meeting in the school, next to the school there was an old kind of empty Methodist church building there. And I remember in the kind of early days as we started to meet in the school, inquiring with lots of different people about who, because I knew that it had been sold, so I knew the Methodists didn't own the building anymore, but it had been sold to one person who'd sold it on to another and on to another. So I kind of inquired to see who owned this building, because it was just sitting empty, and in my head I kind of thought that would be a perfect place to kind of make our permanent home, rather than having to set up a school building every Sunday. And eventually, as I kind of tried in vain to find out who owned the building, my inquiries led me to a former member of the church who lived on the estate opposite, and he could see from his front room window, he could see the church building. And I remember as I spoke to him, as he kind of told me he'd tried to keep track of who owned it, because it had been sold a number of times. So as he kind of told me and talked me through what he knew, I remember him kind of getting quite emotional as he spoke about this building. And especially as he spoke about the fact that he could see, and on a daily basis, he could just see this building which had meant so much to him becoming more and more derelict and getting more and more vandalized on a kind of, say, daily basis almost. And he spoke about just how heartbreaking it was to be able to see that. In some small way, I think that is probably similar to the emotions that the Jews had as they contemplated the temple in Jerusalem. If you remember, kind of 50 or so years previous to this, the Babylonians had come and they'd set fire to the temple. Although it had never been fully demolished. And so it was probably still standing, but it would have been a kind of derelict, damaged sort of shell of a building. And whilst some form of worship and prayer would likely have continued in or certainly around the building through the years of exile from those who remained in the land, it would still, I think, have been a kind of heartbreaking sight, both for those who had remained and saw it kind of every day, but also for those who returned from exile, who, even though they'd probably never seen the original temple, would no doubt have been told tales of its magnificent splendour from their parents and their grandparents. When you've been told just how amazing this is going to be, to get there and see probably what was in front of them would, as I say, I think have been heartbreaking. And so the first task that they set about on their return from exile is to begin rebuilding the temple. And they begin with the altar on which they offer burnt offerings every morning and evening, which was a sign of them dedicating themselves to God at the beginning of each day and then thanking him for his faithfulness to them at the end of each day. And so as we think about them kind of rebuilding the temple, it's probably worth just pausing for a moment to think about the significance of the temple. Because often we hear the word temple, and in our minds, our kind of 21st century Western world minds, we kind of replace the word temple with church, and we think that the two are kind of the same, interchangeable almost. But for the Jews, and especially at this point in history, in the Old Testament, the temple was a far more significant thing than the church is, even for the most ardent Christian today. The temple was more than just a building where they went to worship and to pray to God. It was the place that signified God's presence with them. And that's not the same as saying that they believed that it was the place where God lived, because just a quick look through the Psalms, and we've read one of them this morning, tells you and shows you that they kind of understood that God's dwelling place was the heavens. They talk about God being in the heavens. So it's not that they believed that God physically lived in the temple, but rather the temple, and specifically the Holy of Holies, which was at the heart of the temple, was the place where heaven and earth touched. The place where the two realities or the two dimensions kind of overlapped. And so its destruction by the Babylonian army was more than just a symbol of their defeat to an enemy, but it was also symbolic of the breakdown in their relationship with God. The loss of the temple was also a loss of their place of access to God, a kind of visible sign that he was not with them anymore. We're told back in Ezra chapter 3 that as the foundation for the rebuilt temple is laid, there are great shouts of joy as well as loud weeping from those who were old enough to have seen the original temple. And we're not told specifically what it is that they're weeping about. Perhaps they're weeping with joy, overcome with emotion at a day that they thought that they would never see. Or maybe the tears are as they remember the temple as it once was, with this new version potentially a kind of pale imitation of what went before. And we get a glimpse, I think, of that kind of pale imitation idea here in chapter 6 as we read the dedication of the temple. Because there's certainly celebration, but this new act of dedication was less splendid than the original dedication of the temple, which is described back in 1 Kings chapter 8. And as I read the number of animals that were kind of offered as part of the dedication, there was 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and 12 male goats. That sounds certainly kind of quite impressive. That's a large number of animals to squeeze into a temple, isn't it? However, the earlier story speaks of there being 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep. It was just bigger, more splendid. Furthermore, there's no account here of a cloud that represents the splendor of God coming and filling the temple as it did back in 1 Kings chapter 8. I think it's quite an amusing story as they dedicate the original temple under Solomon, as they do it and they have a great service of praise, and the temple fills with a cloud which signifies God's splendor. And it's so big and so oppressive that actually it forces all the priests and the people out of the temple, and they have to abandon the service because God shows up. I don't know what that says about our services. We've never had to abandon because God shows up. But God, we believe, is here amongst us. But whilst it may well be a pale imitation of what went before, there is no hint here in chapter 6 that the community is disappointed by this event, or that it feels that it is less significant in any way than the original dedication. Instead, we're told that they're filled with joy because they are back celebrating and worshipping in the temple, that God is back with them, his anger with them replaced by favour. Some writers and theologians believe that Psalm 30, which was thought to have been written by David many years earlier, was used as part of this service of dedication. And it explains why, if you look through our Bible, if you get to Psalm 30, it bears the title, A Song at the Dedication of the Temple, even though David wasn't alive when the temple was built. So it's unlikely that David gave it that title. That will have been added later. And if you read Psalm 30, you can see why it may have been used as part of the dedication ceremony. It says, I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up and did not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cry to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you his faithful ones, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but a moment, his favour is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favour, O Lord, you had established me as a strong mountain. You hid your face, I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cried, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my soul may praise you and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever. And although that psalm is written from the perspective of an individual, you can see, I think, how the words of that psalm apply to the situation that the nation of Judah now find themselves in. God's anger with them has passed, and they have found that his faithfulness to them continues. And because of this, he has turned their mourning into dancing, and replaced their weeping with joy. Later on in the Bible, in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul writes that as believers, we are God's new temple, both individually and as a community together. And then in the book of Ephesians goes further to declare that in Christ the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord. The whole structure referring to the church in its entirety, the whole company of those who believe in him throughout the world. And so as we look at this passage on the rebuilding and the dedication of the temple in Ezra chapter 6, I wonder what does it mean for us to be declared as God's temple today? Well, firstly, I think just as for the Jews back in the Old Testament, it means that God is with us. Not just when we gather here at church, but in every moment and in every place. It also means that just as happens for the building here in Ezra 6, we are to be dedicated to God. And we do that when we decide to follow him, when we give our lives to him. And for some of us, that happens suddenly and kind of out of the blue, a sort of Damascus Road kind of experience, where suddenly we're brought low and we have to give our lives to God. It kind of a sort of full 180-degree turn. But for others of us, it's a more gradual turning toward God. But at some point, all of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus have dedicated ourselves to him and offered our lives to him. And just as here in Ezra, that is always a cause for celebration, both personally, as we declare that we have found God's faithfulness toward us and that he has transformed our lives and given us hope for the future. It's also a cause of celebration for the community as another brick is added to God's living temple. And I've already said, next week we're going to see one such celebration as we baptize Saraya and we join with her in celebrating what God has done for her and promising with her to dedicate ourselves again to him and to his work here in Bacup. And that then brings us to the final thing that I want to say. Because often we think of ourselves, I think, as being God's temple because God, in the form of the Holy Spirit, dwells within us. However, we've already thought about the fact that the temple wasn't necessarily the place where God lived, but rather the place where heaven and earth touch. And so, I don't think we're described as being the new temple because God lives within us, but rather because God lives within us, both individually and collectively, we are the place where heaven and earth overlap. Imagine that. What does it look like for heaven and earth to overlap in you? I wonder if people wanted to find God's dwelling place on earth, if people wanted to see the place where heaven and earth touch, would they think of us? Would they think of our church? Would they think of the Christian church throughout the world as being the temple of God? In the Bibles, we get a picture of what it looks like when heaven and earth touch perfectly in the person of Jesus. And we see wherever he goes, it is good news for those people around him. The sick are healed, the hungry are fed, the captives are set free. That then is our calling as temples of the holy, living God, to be the place where heaven and earth touch, to allow God to work through us, to transform our communities and our world. So let us continue to dedicate ourselves to God. I'm inspired by the idea that the Jews went and offered themselves each morning to God and then thanked him for his faithfulness each evening. I wonder, do we dedicate ourselves on a daily basis to God? I heard the former footballer Paul Merson talking on the radio this week, and for those that know Paul Merson, he's a recovering addict from many different things, alcohol, drugs, and gambling. And he was saying that the gambling is particularly the one that's he's really struggling with at the moment. And even through lockdown, kind of lost every penny he had. And one of the questions he was asked was, well, how does your wife, who's stuck by him through this, how does she cope with it? And what promises have you made to her that it won't happen again? And he said, well, I can't promise that I'm never ever going to bet again. He said, I can't even promise that I won't bet this week. He says, all I can do is I wake up and I say to myself, I'm not going to bet today. And he says, and I know that I'm not going to bet today. He says, that's all I can do. I wake up each day and say, I'm not going to have a bet today. I wonder, do we wake up and say, I'm going to dedicate myself to God today? We don't have to promise for kind of weeks and months and years in advance. But do we promise each day to dedicate ourselves to God? Let's continue to do that. Let's continue to dedicate ourselves to God, to carry him with us into the world, into every place and every moment, and to bring his good news to bear within our community, being the place where heaven and earth touch. Amen. In that spirit of dedicating ourselves afresh to God, our next song is I Give You My Heart. I couldn't remember whether this was one that we normally sing and one that we know, so we did have it just before the service, so hopefully you kind of picked up the tune if it's not one that we know. Shall we stand together and sing? And as we sing, let's use the words to dedicate ourselves once more to God.